So, Tal, there's a story told about an Israeli philosopher who comes to America, and the first day there, he's interviewed on radio, and someone says to him, in a word, how are things in Israel? And he says, good. And they said, in 2 words? And he says, no good. I understand that your book was originally entitled Extinction. It was a very subtle way of broadcasting Tal's, the no-good part of his concern about Jewish life. But Tal is one of the more provocative emerging thought leaders and newsmakers on the scene. And he's the author of the new book, God is in the Crowd, 21st Century Judaism, that's attracting a lot of attention. When I was a kid, I thought God was in the cloud, but that was different. Tal grew up in a secular Jewish home in America, started thinking seriously about his Jewish identity when he was a teenager, and moved to Israel on his own and became a fighter pilot in the Israeli Air Force, which is a real rarity for an American. He later became an entrepreneur in Israel and New York, and he wrote this book because he became increasingly worried in seeing the large gap between the diaspora, primarily the American Jewish community, and Israel. And many would agree that those two communities are moving further apart. So he puts forward some very creative ideas to help deal with that problem in the book. And it's based on the concept of the wisdom of the crowd. So I thought maybe we'd start there, and welcome. And maybe you can tell us a bit about your transformation and how you came to this, this basis of the book about crowd wisdom.
Sure. I came to Judaism in what I today consider the wrong way, and I committed to Judaism for the wrong reasons, as I see them. So as Gary said, I really grew up without any real Jewish content in my life. I think, like most American Jews, I knew I was Jewish. I didn't know what that meant. It was a box I ticked on, on forms that asked for your religion. I have 3 older brothers who all married non-Jewish women. We're more or less a mirror image or kind of a microcosm of American Judaism as a whole in our family. I went to boarding school. I grew up in Miami, but I went to boarding school in New Hampshire from the age of 10. So I lived in a very un-Jewish environment there. And it never occurred to me that I should feel different from the people I was going to school with because I was Jewish, and I never did feel different. I think my real Jewish awareness started with a photograph that I saw when I was 16. Most of you will recognize it. It's the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto. It's taken in 1943. He has his hands up. He's in. And I was struck. This is, I think, how I really found my way to Israel. I was struck by the notion that I was looking at this picture in the wrong way. It's framed, if you can picture it, the boy must be 6 or 7 years old, very angelic face. The Nazis on the right, heavily armed, their guns pointed in his direction, and it's framed in a way that almost begs a juxtaposition between this boy's innocence and the barbarism of the Nazis. And I couldn't bring myself to hate the Nazis. I wasn't angry at them. They just seemed irrelevant to me, uninteresting. I didn't know much about Jewish history, but I knew enough to understand that this comes and goes. They were just that generation's manifestation of an age-old phenomenon. and there were Cossacks before that, and there were inquisitors, and there were crusaders. This is not new. They just change uniform, and it doesn't matter. They'll fade out, somebody else will replace them. What was relevant, though, is if you Google the picture later, you'll notice on the left side of the picture is the boy's family or neighbors. They're just being evacuated from their building in the ghetto. And they're also in this sort of stance of shocked submission. And I was angry at them, really angry. I couldn't believe that they had abrogated their most fundamental duty, which is to protect this child. They had no contingency plan. They seemed to have allowed themselves to believe that they were Poles, and they weren't. They were Jews. And we don't get to be real members of the majorities we live in. We're never real Frenchmen, never real Arabs, never real Germans, never real Poles. We're Jews. And how could you not have had a contingency plan? And as far as I know, that whole picture was dead within a week. Took me about a week to figure out that, hang on a second, I'm probably closer in age to the parents than I am to the boy, and what's my contingency plan? I've never really conceived of myself as anything but American. I'm Jewish, and am I any different from these people? And when I started talking to friends, Jewish friends, and there were Jewish friends at Exeter, people looked at me like I was crazy. What are these questions? What are you talking about? And my family, I mean, nobody understood why this is an important question for a 16-year-old Jewish kid. And I began to think of myself as sort of very original and subversive in my thinking, until I went on a trip to Israel on what is kind of a precursor of Birthright. It's kind of a 6-week teen tour of Israel. And what I saw there really, I mean, it blew me away. I saw people who not only had the courage to ask that question that I had asked, but they weren't doing it in theory in a dorm room in New Hampshire. They were asking it and answering it on the ground. They were paying the price of reclaiming, willingly paying the price of reclaiming Jewish agency. And what I experienced in Israel for the first time was Jewish dignity. And it hit me then that's what was so jarring to me in that picture, was the total lack of dignity. And I fell in love and moved to Israel, and through a kind of a series of wrong turns, frankly, ended up in the Air Force in a very, very intense environment that didn't leave me any time to question, what exactly am I doing here? You know, this was kind of a college kid's adventure, not much more than that. Certainly didn't question Judaism. I still knew nothing about Judaism, and woke up at some point in my late 20s with the realization that I'm here because of the Nazis. I've allowed the inquisitors and the Cossacks to define me. What a pathetic foundation for an identity. The anti-Semites are what makes me a Jew. And had to ask the question, and it was really a moment of crisis for me. Why am I Jewish? Why be Jewish? And I look back at the United States, and I'll end with this, and see my 3 older brothers with their wonderful families, and my great nieces and nephews, who I'm still very close with today, who are not Jewish. And they don't identify as Jewish, and they have nothing against Jews. Their father was born Jewish. I think that's how most of them would describe themselves. Their kids won't be Jewish. They are truly American. And I think, and we can debate this afterwards, I know a lot of people feel differently about this, this is not Poland. I really think that this is America, is a new phenomenon in Jewish history, perhaps as consequential a phenomenon as Israel in Jewish history. And if that's the case, if we don't have the anti-Semites to define us, we are called upon for the first time in 2,000 years to actually define ourselves. What is this? What are we doing here?
So you suggest in the book that the real crisis for American Jews is assimilation, not anti-Semitism. Did the tragedy in Pittsburgh have any impact in terms of your rethinking of that?
Right. Well, so I hope it doesn't get us into trouble, but I'll say that it actually fortified that conviction, in that, I mean, taking nothing away from 11 broken families and 11 individual tragedies, nothing. I think the real story is not that any crazy can get a gun in this country and walk into a church in South Carolina or a bar in California or a synagogue in Pittsburgh and act on his craziness. The real story to me is the Irish Catholic-owned Pittsburgh Steelers showing up as the pallbearers at the funerals, at the Kaddish being the front page headline of the newspaper in Pittsburgh, in the Magen David appearing on the uniforms of the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Pittsburgh Penguins, wall-to-wall support, Democrats, Republicans, Christians, Muslims, for what is perceived as an attack on Americans who are explicitly Jewish. We're not hiding the fact that these people were targeted because they were Jewish, which I think puts Pittsburgh in the category, to me, of a terrorist attack in Israel, which, again, individual tragedy, obviously no less than what we're seeing here, but Israelis don't walk around scared. They understand that these things, yes, they happen, they're tragic, they're terrible. The system is behind you. The first responders are going to come and they're going to put their lives down in your defense. The entire system is there to protect you. It will fail occasionally, but it is on your side. This is not Europe. It's very, very different. It's exactly the same thing here. I don't think we should feel any less safe after Pittsburgh as Jews in America, and any less American. And again, I do understand that there are other interpretations of that, but that's mine.
So it turns out I was in Israel when this happened. I was, and maybe we can talk about that later, I was at the UJA-Federation movement, and the theme actually was Let's Talk. It was sort of acknowledging that there's a disturbingly increasing divide between American Jews and Israel. Again, my observation was that it was frustrating, although not surprising, that there was little actual discussion about the real issues. There was a lot of acknowledgement about the issues, the Kotel, conversion, Jewish identity, those kinds of things, but not so much really tackling the problem itself. And one of the things I felt, first of all, I felt very far away and sort of lacking in community when I was there. Obviously, Israelis were very empathetic about what happened, but at least from some conversations I had, and certainly from the Israeli media, it became a political issue very quickly about Naftali Bennett was the first person to come. He's a diaspora minister. Some people complained about, and Ron Dermer as well, the ambassador, that their statements seemed to be too equivocal about, this could have come from the left or the right. And it seemed like the Pittsburgh Jewish community was more concerned about the president's perhaps being somewhat responsible, and other Jews felt that way too. Again, without going into the details, it seemed like one more case of where American Jews and Israelis don't understand each other, and the president is in the middle in this. And I can understand both sides. Israelis feel he's doing a great job for us, and Americans come at it in a different place. The Kotel is another example. Israelis say, what's the big deal? This is a place for religious Jews to pray. American Jews say this is about equality. And I'm sure there are plenty of other examples, but how do you, what's your response to what you saw play out?
So I think at its root, at its most fundamental, is neither Jewish community is engaged in being Jewish. That's not really what most of us are about. If you came to this talk, you're probably not who I'm talking about, but you're also not representative of most of American Jewry. what we see in Israel, the way I put it in the book is, we have we came to a very un-Jewish process for defining Jewish nationhood. What does nation state of the Jews mean? And the way we defined it is a way that is very confusing to Israelis as well, but I think is absolutely undecipherable to many American Jews, certainly to casual observers of Israel. And I think what we've done is, when we had to decide on a question of Judaism, what is Jewish and what's not Jewish in diaspora, there was no sovereign, there was no global Jewish sovereign to adjudicate disputes over things. I would argue that dispute was our mechanism, right, on everything, and eventually merit would win out on small questions like, are you going to eat rice on Passover? Is that kosher or not? And on big questions like, who's a Jew? How does one become a Jew? Is that possible? How does somebody become not a Jew? Can we excommunicate? These are important questions. These are big questions. And because we didn't have any, we had some local, I would say, kind of limited local sovereignty at times in certain parts in diaspora, but certainly no pope, no Jewish pope. Nobody could definitively answer these questions, no single person. We had a crowd coming together to answer these questions, and if you want, we can get into it afterwards. What exactly is crowd wisdom? What is that field in statistics? Because I think it applies very neatly to Jewish governance in diaspora. We've lost it in the United States and Israel, which is now the stand-in for diaspora. Right? Diaspora is no longer a useful model for describing the physical distribution of Jews in the world. 90% of us are here and in Israel. It hasn't been like this in 2,000 years. We are concentrated in two jurisdictions, notably two philo-Semitic, in my view, jurisdictions. It is a new paradigm. We've never seen this before, and life has never been this good for the individual Jew. In Israel, though, when we had to define Jewish statehood, we had three competing visions. We still have three competing visions. Very largely, I call it the secularist vision, the theocratic vision, and the territorialist vision. The secularist vision, by and large, which is not only secular people, I think there are a lot of religiously observant secularists in Israel, but these are people who are seeking democracy for Jewish people, maybe with some bells and whistles. We'll have Jewish holidays as the national holidays, but not much else. We certainly don't want the government prescribing Jewishness to the citizenry. That is the secularist view of Israel. And to be fair, I don't think it's adequate. I don't think it's enough of an ambition. It's not a sustaining vision for Israel. There's a theocratic vision of Israel, which in 1947 it had very few adherents, and those that it had very limited political ambitions in Israel. Today it has many adherents with maximalist political ambitions and want to make the country into a theocracy. And a territorialist vision that views the land of Israel as a higher priority than democracy. If we have to trade one, we're going to give up on democracy instead of land. These are segregated communities, to be clear. We live in different geographies. We study in different education systems. We're not even the same type of citizen. We each have different rights and obligations to society as citizens, and that's enshrined in the law in Israel, something I think very few of us understand. I would argue that theocratic Israel is becoming, through a phenomenon we can discuss if it's of interest, a very distorted version of Judaism. It's not consistent with Jewish history from the last 2,000 years. I think it's actually quite un-Jewish in many ways. I'll leave the territorialists aside for now. Secularist Israel is not Jewish. It's not Jewish. And the authors of that vision were socialists who were very actively trying to erase any vestige of a kind of a European Jewish stereotype when we came to Israel, and maybe we wouldn't have survived without that. It's not about faulting people, but it's left secularist Israel, without a compelling vision for why we're doing what we do. And what I see happening now in Israel, and this is again something that I don't And maybe it's evident in Israel to some Israelis, it's certainly very difficult to see from the United States, is the secularists being chased out of the system. Why is that important? If you look at the Israeli tax base, 20% of the Israeli tax base pays in more than it takes out. 80% takes out more than it pays in. Very much like any capitalist democracy. That's how the United States looks as well. It's 80-20. The problem is that that entire 20% in Israel is secularists. That's who they are. Again, they might live in Ariel or in Efrat, so they might have real sympathy for the territory of Israel, but the test would be, what do you give up on first, democracy or land? They're giving up on land. They are committed to Jewish democracy, and certainly are not advocates of theocracy. They're also sending their kids to fight our wars in Israel, pretty uniformly, right? Pretty much 100% of seculars send their children to the army in Israel. The territorialists do send their kids to the army. I think they're the best kids we have right now, actually. I'm full of admiration for that, the ethic and the self-sacrifice and the humility of that community. They're incredible people. But keeping them safe and keeping them, their infrastructure intact is costing us billions of dollars. So they are a net drain economically. The theocrats are a drain both economically and militarily. And I think what we're seeing today, and I bet you there are people in this audience that are representative of this phenomenon, and maybe I am myself, is the secularists gradually leaving. And they're not leaving in protest. It's not that, you know, we're sick of paying all, no. They're coming here for graduate school or for a job in Silicon Valley or on Wall Street. And what was not a choice, not a decision when you were in Israel. Your kid turns 16, all of his friends get draft papers, he gets draft papers. There's no decision happening here. It's kind of like you know, going to college, you know, in the United States. Most American Jews don't sit down with their kids in 11th grade and have the college talk. Are we going to do college or not? It's kind of assumed, of course, that's what we're doing. It's a special case. If you know, same in Israel. We don't really think about it. But when you're sitting in Palo Alto and your kid's 16, you are making a decision. And there's all sorts of details that you've got to work, mundane details. What's your tax status when you move back to Israel? If I wait another year, can I get a better tax deal? These are things that everyone should consider, and they do. And now you're starting to weigh costs and benefits. And I think what we're seeing today is more and more people, and I include the people that I flew with, the Israelis I admired most, the people I mimicked to become an Israeli, you know, in accent and in manner. That's how I became an Israeli, was by copying these kibbutzniks that I flew with. About half of them don't live in Israel today. Some of them are married to non-Jews. I would argue, I'm pretty convinced that very few of them will ever go back to Israel. Because their kids are 16, and I'm seeing it happening now. We're seeing it with our own 16-year-old. And you look back and you say, hang on a second. Because Gary's grandfather got on one boat in Poland and my grandfather got on another boat, he gets to send his kids to Stanford, and I got to send my kids to sit at a checkpoint and get brutalized for 3 years. I don't have to sign up for that. And increasingly, it's unclear to me why I have been signing up for that. Very long answer, I apologize, but to the point of, for the secularist in Israel, there is no Jewishness in being Israeli. We're not serving the Jewish people. It took me 10 years to realize that every time I went into battle, I had Jews in Baltimore in the back of my mind, and Jews in St. Petersburg in the back of my mind. That's who I was fighting for, and Jews in Tel Aviv, of course. The kibbutznik wingman wasn't really thinking about those people. I don't think he really cared about those people. He cared deeply about the Israeli Druze and the Israeli Muslim, who I care about as well, for sure, but didn't really feel a kinship. He certainly didn't feel a Jewish kinship with those people. That is essentially what we have to address, both in Israel and the United States. The good news is it's the same problem. I think we can address it together. We have to address it together.
So you address it primarily in the book through crowd wisdom, and maybe you can just describe that, and then have a couple questions about that.
Yeah, okay.
Sure.
So crowd wisdom, I think the easiest way to conceptualize it is if you've seen in a party or like a county fair, sometimes there's a game where you have a big jar of jelly beans or gumballs or something like that, and you have to guess how many there are in the jar. Have people seen that before? Yeah. So what's interesting in that game is not who's the best at guessing the number of gumballs, although we've done this a lot. And some people are actually very good at that. What's interesting in that game is if you have a big enough group guessing, and you take the simple average of all their guesses, it's usually better than the best guess in the entire group, which should shock us. It should shock us. Right? You have 761 gumballs in the jar. The best guess will be whatever, 780. The average will be 763, something really, really close to the right number. There's no faith in this. This is absolutely repeatable. You run the experiment 1,000 times, you'll get the same result. There is a sentience and intelligence that we can access in community that we cannot access as individuals. And financial markets often work this way. They often work very differently. But there are a lot of examples of this phenomenon happening. But there are 4 conditions that distinguish between a wise crowd and other crowds. Right? Most crowds are not wise. Most crowds are arbitrary. Some crowds are emphatically stupid. By the way, the market can play that way as well. Some crowds are violent. Different crowds have different personalities. Wisdom is a pretty narrow subset.
This is a good crowd.
It's a good crowd. The 4 preconditions are pretty simple, if counterintuitive, but they're easy to understand. The first is that we all have to be trying to answer the same question. If all of you guys are trying to guess how many gumballs are on the jar, and I'm trying to figure out the volume of the jar, my guess should not be included in the average. I've got to be answering the same question that everyone else is answering. We should be independent in our inputs. If I get up on the stage and say, I think it's 7,000 gumballs, and you were thinking 1,000, you might revise your estimate. That's called groupthink, right? That's not good. We should not share. We should not compare notes before doing it, or certainly not in a wide forum. The third is that we should be diverse. It's wonderful that one of us is a dentist and one of us is a lawyer and one of us is a real estate broker. That's great. We come at this from different perspectives. What's very counterintuitive about that is a diverse crowd will do better at guessing the number of gumballs than a crowd composed entirely of experts. Right? If we're all expert gumball counters, we'll actually achieve a worse result than a crowd that has some expert gumball counters, but also some children who are just going to throw out a random guess, some people who come at it from a very different point. It's not an intuitive point, but it's also very consistent. And then the fourth and last is that we need some aggregation mechanism. We need some way to cull everybody's inputs into a single answer. So in a simple quantitative static question, like how many gumballs are there in this jar, it's actually very difficult to beat a simple average. And we've tried. There are different mathematical approaches you can take to beating an average. Some of them work, but they're very difficult. And the simple average is actually fantastic. Markets solve that question in a much more complex way. And there are a lot of machines out there, kind of call it prediction algorithms that use crowd wisdom also with a more complex aggregation method. But as long as it's consistent and objective, many aggregation mechanisms can work. What I argue is happening to the Jews, or has happened to the Jews over the centuries, is we did have a common set of questions, and they were codified in Mishnah. And then I think this is, when we talk about kind of reinventions of Judaism, there have been 3. The last one was the expulsion from Israel by the Roman Empire, and with it the codification of the oral law in Mishnah, which had us all reading a common set of questions across Judaism. It's questions, right? It's posed as questions. It's not edicts, it's questions. And we expanded on those questions, and we continued to contribute to the evolution of the answers to those questions to raise new and related questions. The Romans helped us with independence and diversity, right? If you went off to Lodz and I went off to Cordoba, for most of the diaspora, we didn't know each other. We might not have even known about each other. We were evolving on different paths. Our contributions became, with each generation, more and more different to the evolution of those questions. We were diverse. You were probably involved in some agrarian pursuit. You probably spoke Polish and Yiddish. You probably spoke Hebrew as well if you were active in this exercise. I spoke Italian. I was probably lending money. That was one of the only things I could do. I was interacting with a very different community. We were diverse. We came to these questions very differently. And then the last is the aggregation mechanism, which I think has happened through, we touched on this, the lack of sovereignty. We were expelled from where we lived hundreds of times over the last 2,000 years, dozens of times in a big way, and had the opportunity, and frankly the impetus to, or the imperative, sorry, to reconcile our divergent views, right? So if, well, I'm expelled from Cordoba and you're expelled from Sevilla in 1492. When we meet in Istanbul 10 years later, we actually need to get our story straight. My kids don't eat rice on Passover, yours do. We need to come up with an answer. And that often took generations, and I think I would say it takes. It's a constant process in Judaism. We didn't have a pope to rule through an edict. This is how we're doing it. It is rice. It doesn't matter what any dissenting view. We had to sort of duke it out. So crowd wisdom, to me, is a very neat model for Jewish governance for the last 1,800 years.
So, I mean, obviously crowd wisdom is a modern term, but as you say, in Jewish tradition, there's a saying like, go into the street and listen to the people and then decide the halacha, the Jewish law. So that's the same idea. Blue Greenberg, who's a well-known Jewish feminist, she says when there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way. So maybe that's sort of the flip side of it, because when there isn't, there isn't. But isn't there a danger in following the crowd when the crowd isn't educated, or you can have a charismatic leader who can lead people on, we've had false messiahs before in our history. How does that compute? Right.
Well, we might have one right now, right? And well, there are two of them, right? The two chief rabbis of Israel. So I would argue that that's an emphatic abrogation of governance by the crowd, right? We've now, the way we do this in Israel, if the United States, we lost sight of the common question, right? And we don't know. I grew up, like most American Jews, with I don't think I knew the word Talmud, growing up. It just was a completely foreign notion to me. We've lost sight of the questions in Israel, in the United States. In Israel, we've lost the aggregation mechanism. So we're not acting as a crowd anymore in Israel. We have two people as the ultimate arbiters of what is Jewish and what is not, who is Jewish and who is not. And again, I'm not trying to vilify any specific person. At the end of the day, we're all human beings. Power corrupts. These two guys are the sons of previous men who held that position. What are the odds? This is a corrupt institution, and like any institution that is not, that has no checks and balances, it will ultimately optimize for its own survival, and that's what's happening today. And when we talk about the divide between American and Israeli Jewry, one of the elements of that has been those American Jews who choose to engage, which unfortunately today is a minority of us, are being told by the Israeli government, by the nation state of the Jews, by our nation state, you're second class here. And I don't know whether Rabbi Lau said Pittsburgh was a synagogue or was not a synagogue. The tone has been very clear. The rejection of rabbis' conversions and marriages has been very clear. The fact that cuts right through the middle of modern orthodoxy today. Everything that's modern orthodox and left of that is patently unwelcome in Israel. And even if you're right of that, it's unclear that you're that can't be sustained.
Well, I think that's another difference between American and Israeli Jews, is that you have no separation of church or synagogue and state. So you have a situation like that with the chief rabbinate, which is part of the government. And for Americans, we are so grounded in the separation of church and state. And I think that was a big reason why this diaspora has been the best ever for Jews, any in history. So that we're just coming at it from two totally different places. To switch gears a little bit, the word disruptive used to be a negative word. Nowadays, to be a disruptor and to be disruptive can be a very good thing. And I think your book fits into that category, and probably intended to disrupt the way we think about things. And I guess, what would you like most to disrupt in Jewish life today?
Right. Well,
you can start with a list of about 432 things, but...
Right, so on disruption, I always try to be very conscious writing this book. This is not a kvetchy book. This is not the sky is falling, Gewalt. I really actually don't believe in disruption without an alternative plan. It's not enough to say what's happening now is no good. In fact, it's, I think, intellectually dishonest to say what's happening now is no good. To the rabbi's point about a religion being the cause of so much death in the world, and would it be a better world without religion? Let's see the alternative, because I don't know that that's the case, right? If we had another universe as a control group that had no religion, but everything else was the same, maybe we could make that claim with some certainty. I can certainly say that most of the tens of millions who were slaughtered in the last century were slaughtered in the name of atheist ideologies. So I'm not sure that it's religion really that's driving that. Yeah, it might be the putative term that we use before we kill somebody, but I'm not sure that's where it's coming from. I'm also not sure that Judaism fits so well into that category, religion. And I think part of the issue, and this is maybe one of the things I'd like to disrupt or challenge, is in this country, which accounts for 40+% of world Jewry, there's, I think, been a bit of a conflation in that we think of Judaism in very Christian terms in this country. We use the term religion and faith more or less interchangeably in the United States. That works really well in every Christian denomination, but in Judaism, faith is just not that important. I find it's not in a sense, it's not a mitzvah to believe. You shouldn't believe in or hold somebody higher than God. We're not explicitly saying if you don't believe, you're not really part of it. And what I found interviewing a lot of particularly young American Jews with the tough question, why be Jewish? A lot of people come back with, well, I'm an atheist, so it's irrelevant to me. I'm not, it's not irrelevant. That's not the exercise that we're doing. And that's the reason the book is called God is in the Crowd, because I'm trying to say, let's remove that threshold. You don't have to embrace what we have here, this I think, very, very rich and valuable legacy that we inherited, whether we know it or not. But before rejecting it, have a quick look at what it is. And it's not about faith. This is not Christianity. The main disruption, number one, is let's not be passive about our Judaism anymore. Let's rise to the challenge of the generations of Jews who are alive today, everybody in this room, and reinvent Judaism. That is our challenge.
So there's several provocative ideas that Tal puts forth in the book. And one of them is a kind of world Jewish endowment. And so it would offer Jews who pay into it a number of benefits. And there would be a free summer camp, participation in a Tikkun Olam project. They talk about the kid who comes back from birthright and he says, how do you say Tikkun Olam in Hebrew? because Tikkun Olam is a very common word now. It would, and I guess to me the most controversial part is the big perk is it would offer families free undergraduate education for their kid when they go to college. And I guess if there's some pushback here, it would be most American Jewish families, however squeezed they are financially, make the university experience for their kids a priority. So they're going to do that anyway. And the real problem has been Jewish education. So why not use that money to help encourage people to have a Jewish education if this is all about keeping the Jewish faith going?
Right. So, first of all, there's an Air Force expression that a bad plan is better than no plan. So I'm putting forward a bad plan. And it is a plan that's written to be amended. And I've met with enough Jews that it is being amended quite
even as we speak.
Even as we speak, which is wonderful. The idea behind college versus, for example, Hebrew day school. First of all, I couldn't figure out a way. I mean, if you read the book, you'll see it's actually a business plan with numbers and assumptions, which I put out on a website, and you can challenge them and play with the model. I couldn't make the numbers work for day school. It's just too expensive and too many years, and you don't get the time value of money. In our model, you're paying in for quite a few years before you actually start taking out the big benefits, which is university. That's the first. The second is polling a lot of American Jewish parents, and particularly Israeli Jewish parents. Give them day school for free, they don't want it. They're just not interested. And it's actually, those are the people that I'm most interested in, is the people who have already written off their Judaism completely and have no ambition to even engage. Those who have an ambition to engage but can't make it work financially will often find another way to make it work. And we should help them. I'm definitely not arguing against that, but it's the massive numbers, and the numbers are massive, and we need to understand that, massive, who really have no reason to want to do this. Almost everybody is worried about paying for college. Almost everybody's worried about, God forbid my kid gets into a good private university in this country. How am I going to pay for that? So in many ways, this is a bribe. It's a bait and switch. It's, come in for a different reason. I'm okay with that. I understand not everybody is. But what I'm going to ask you to do on the way is likely to get you hooked, or at least curious about Judaism. Not 100%, and you can walk away from it, and we're not asking you to commit to anything, but we're hoping that if we do it for 100,000 people, 50,000 will say, you know what, this is for me.
So those of you who read the New York Times book review section, that the lead story comes out online the Monday before. So this past Monday, we got a preview of Sunday's lead story, and it's a very interesting one to this audience. And I think Tal could have written the headline, which was "American Jews Face a Choice: Create Meaning or Fade Away." Right. So the writer here is in a sense, this essay is reviewing 5 books, and Tal's book is one of them. And so he calls your book a, quote, "a pox on both your houses indictment of Israel and American Jewry that are, quote, destroying themselves by staying so far apart." He gives you credit for the, quote, worthy aim of trying to shock American Judaism out of complacency. But I guess he concludes that your solutions are too improbable. Just wondered how you respond.
Yeah, so I get a lot of that, as you can imagine, especially in Israel. What I'm putting forward is, first of all, what I think has to get done. Whether it gets done in exactly the way I presented or not is a second question, and it's probably not, and that's fine. That actually is fine with me. I'm not dealing so much with predicting the outcome here. This is what we have to do. If you need to go to battle, you need to go to battle. You're being attacked, you need to defend yourself. If you spend your time equivocating about how successful you're going to be defending yourself, I can give you the answer already as to how successful you're going to be. We have to fight this fight. We have to, if we want there to be Judaism in the world. I'm less interested in how realistic these prescriptions are and more interested in making them happen. I'm pretty sure Zionism, Herzl got a lot of, not comparing myself, but a lot of big ideas that have been transformational for our people and for people in general started off as very unlikely, unrealistic notions. And I think we are in a place right now where it's not going to be an incremental change, increase funding for day schools or something like that, or send more kids to Israel on a 10-day tour. I don't think that's what's going to do it. We need to do something radical.
Okay. Well, you hear the message, and so if you have a question, I'd ask if you could raise your hand.
Right. The question is there a trade-off between creating real Jewish knowledge and our integration and acceptance in American society? Is that more or less? Okay, fair enough. Because I'm certainly not saying that the orthodox prescription for endowing us with Jewish knowledge is the only one, and there should not be only one. There should be many. That's who we are. I'm asking us to raise the bar for ourselves. And if you look at Judaism for the last 1,800 years, we've been multilingual. Pretty much every Jewish community for the last 1,800 years has been multilingual, right? If we were in Europe, we typically, right, we could pray and maybe study in Hebrew. We spoke Yiddish in our community, and we spoke whatever lingua franca was prevalent in our region, Russian, German, French, whatever it was. Same thing in North Africa and in the Middle East. The generation of Jews we're raising right now is monolingual in general, by and large, right? Most American Jews really only are fluent in English. Most Israeli Jews are really only fluent in Hebrew. Many of us are conversant in English. It's very, very different. We don't really have a command of English. I think that's something that's hurting Israel as an economy and as society as well. We can demand more of ourselves. I don't think we need to give up on our Americanism in this country in order to embrace our Judaism. It's a big ask. I'm not saying it's a simple thing to juggle, but we've been juggling tensions forever. That's in many ways what is kind of the defining feature of Judaism is this tension between the tribe and and the wider world, the particular and the universal. I think it's something we can do. So the question is, how do you connect crowd wisdom to this set of prescriptions? So I'm going to say it very briefly now, and I don't think there's, I wish there were a way to do it justice, standing on one foot. We've tried to do elevator pitches for that. It's, got to read the book. So please do read it. But one layer of the prescription is, let's actually have a record. If you look at the record of Talmudic disputation over the centuries, that's something that we should not allow to end, right? And Judaism has to completely, there's never been a generation of Jews that bequeathed to their children the same Judaism that they inherited from their parents. We have constantly reformed what this is, right? What Judaism is. Diaspora, as I described, was actually a fundamental driver of wisdom in the Jewish crowd. The fact that we didn't have central sovereignty was actually important. I'm not saying we should go back to Poland, but one of the things I propose is it's really a technology solution that will allow us to conduct that exercise without leaving our homes. You can do it from home, but to give the Jewish crowd a voice. It's not the same thing as democracy. This is not voting on rice or no rice on Pesach. It is an exercise in crowd wisdom. I'm going to stop it there and hope that it intrigues you enough to read it, but I develop it in the book.
My question is, if you look at your family, your three brothers, and you offered your parents what you're proposing, would they have accepted it, and would it have made a difference?
My answer, the short answer, right, the good, is I don't know. I don't know. I think the more important answer, though, is we don't need everybody to buy in. In fact, it's never been that way, that everybody buys in. In periods where apostasy was an option for the Jews, it was rampant. And that's, whether that was in Spain or in Germany, in different times in diaspora, when we could integrate, many of us did. And that's okay. I don't think the goal should be 100%. By the way, on the other side as well, let's be clear. The reason Northern European Jews tend to be fair-skinned and North African Jews tend to be dark-skinned is not Darwinism. Okay, we've also let people in. We've let people out, we've let people in. It's always been semi-permeable. That's who we are. I don't think there's any case for ending that today or for handing the keys to two guys to decide who's in and who's out. That we've always been able to negotiate that. I don't see my brothers' marriages or marrying out as a tragedy, and my family didn't perceive it as a tragedy. I still don't today, on the individual level. It's love. Love, in my experience, is hard. If you find it, grab it, don't question it. It's hard. But there's a tension between the individual and the community, and that tension has guided Judaism from the beginning. If you think of the story, our defining story, the defining event of Judaism, the Exodus. What is the story of the Exodus for the individual? 602,000 Jewish males get up and leave Egypt, immediately start complaining to Moses that this was a bad idea. It was better in Egypt, and we weren't there, so who are we to dispute that? Let's assume they were right. It was better in Egypt. And then what happened to them? They died, all of them, miserable, and two of them didn't die. Right? Joshua and Caleb. They're the only two people who made it into the Promised Land, who left Egypt and also made it to the Promised Land. And yet we see the Exodus as our defining gift. We get the Torah, we get the Promised Land, we get sovereignty. This is our defining gift. It's a gift that can only be received in community. It's a curse to the individual. All of those individuals died miserable, lonely deaths in the desert. It was their children and grandchildren who actually made it into the Promised Land. That tension has guided Judaism throughout. So whether my parents specifically, would have bought into this or not is an interesting question for me and for my parents. But for us as a community, it's got to be about the numbers. Meaning, let's not grieve for every Jew who chooses to turn away from Judaism. Let's embrace those who stay in, and let's recognize it's not a sin to have left. By the way, you can also come back, and one of the things I write about is also, if you choose to intermarry, I'm not sure that's got to be a death sentence for you as a Jew. Maybe there's a way to actually use that as a tool to keep our numbers where they are.
So just by way of closing and picking up on what Tal just said, I think part of the tension between the Israeli community and the American Jewish community is that, as you say, in Israel, community is everything. And in diaspora life for American Jews, and particularly in the 21st century, it's all about the individual. And I think that tension is just heightens some of the other issues. So in thanking Tal, I want to not only thank you for being here and being so articulate and explaining your views, but I thank you for writing this book. I think for all of us, I don't think you did it for the glory. I think that trying to shake us up and get us to engage and think about things that maybe we take for granted, and the fact that we are at such a pivotal point in our history as Jews, wherever we are, is very important. So I'm preaching to the converted because you're the people who came out to be here tonight. So I thank all of you, and I thank the congregation here at Kol Ami for hosting us, and for UJA-Federation for partnering with us, and thank you, Tal, for doing this evening.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.